March 1945, Yorkshire countryside. Young German prisoners stumbled through the gates of Camp 174, eyes hollow with dread. They'd heard the stories, whispered in trenches, passed through ranks, of Allied vengeance, of retribution for 6 years of devastation. They braced for brutality, for starvation, for punishment their propaganda had promised awaited them. Instead, British guards handed them tea, hot soup, blankets that weren't threadbare. The shock was absolute. What followed would redefine not just these boys' lives, but Britain's approach to an enemy who'd bombed their cities to rubble. 14th of March 1945, 07:30 hours precisely. Camp 174, North Yorkshire. Temperature 3 degrees Celsius. The morning air carried that peculiar dampness that seeped through greatcoats and into bones, the kind of cold that defined British springs and made even locals reach for an extra layer. Through the mist rolling across the moors, lorries rumbled along the muddy track leading to the camp's main gate, their engines coughing exhaust that mixed with breath and became visible ghosts in the dawn light. Inside those vehicles sat 63 German prisoners of war, the youngest, barely 17, captured during the Rhine crossing 3 weeks prior. Major William Thornton stood by the reception building, clipboard in hand, watching the convoy approach. At 42, he'd seen action at Dunkirk, spent 2 years rebuilding shattered divisions, and buried too many lads who'd never reached their 20th birthday. His own son, Michael, had died over Hamburg in 43, a Lancaster pilot whose letters home had stopped arriving one Tuesday in September. The telegram came 3 days later. Thornton knew what hatred felt like, how it could settle in your chest like concrete, how you could wake at 0300 hours and feel rage before you felt anything else. Behind him, the camp stretched across 12 acres of requisitioned farmland, rows of Nissen huts, administrative buildings fashioned from corrugated iron and timber, a medical facility that had once been a barn, perimeter fencing topped with wire. Nothing elaborate, nothing brutal, functional, British. The camp currently housed 1,247 German POWs, maintained by a rotating staff of 156 British personnel, augmented by Home Guard volunteers, too old for active service. Every morning, Thornton reviewed the same statistics: food consumption rates, medical supplies inventory, work detail assignments, incident reports. The arithmetic of managing captive human beings in a nation still burying its dead. The lorries stopped. Tailgates dropped with metallic clangs that echoed across the compound. The first prisoner emerged tentatively, a thin boy with blonde hair plastered to his skull by rain that had fallen throughout their overnight journey from the processing center in Southampton. He wore the remnants of a Wehrmacht uniform, tunic torn at the shoulder, boots held together by wire. His face carried that peculiar expression Thornton had learned to recognize instantly, the mask of someone expecting violence, muscles tensed for the first blow, eyes tracking movement with animal wariness. "Raus, schnell!" barked Sergeant Davies, gesturing toward the assembly area. His German was serviceable, learned through 2 years of managing prisoners. The boy moved, stumbled, caught himself. Others followed, forming a ragged line. They looked like scarecrows, Thornton thought. 73 days since deployment, minimal rations, constant retreat. The smell reached him even from 20 feet away. Unwashed bodies, infection, fear sweat that no amount of rain could wash clean. Private Collins appeared at Thornton's elbow, carrying a wooden crate. He was 19, local Yorkshire lad, exempt from frontline service after taking shrapnel in his leg at Caen. "Tea ready, sir. Soup's heating in the kitchen. Quartermaster says we got the blankets from that Liverpool shipment, the thick ones." Thornton nodded. The decision he'd made 3 months ago still sat uneasily with some of his staff. When he'd first arrived to command Camp 174 in December 1944, he'd found conditions that met minimum Geneva Convention requirements: shelter, basic food, medical care when absolutely necessary, nothing more. The previous commander had operated on the principle that these were the enemy, that every comfort provided to Germans was an insult to British casualties. Thornton understood that arithmetic too. His son's death had certainly taught him the equation, but he'd also remembered something else. A conversation in Cairo, 1941, before everything went to hell in Greece. An intelligence officer named Pemberton, brilliant man, Cambridge-educated, speaking about interrogation techniques. Cruelty makes them remember their loyalty, makes them heroes in their own story. Kindness confuses them, disrupts the narrative they've been fed. A prisoner treated humanely questions everything he was taught about his enemy. That confusion becomes cooperation. Statistical reality supported Pemberton's theory. Thornton had requested data from War Office, camps reporting violent incidents, escape attempts, deaths from malnutrition or disease, then cross-referenced against camps maintaining higher care standards. The correlation was stark. Better conditions, 78% reduction in escapes, 64% reduction in violent incidents, 89% reduction in fatal diseases. Cooperation during interrogation increased by factor of 12. The arithmetic made sense, even if emotion resisted it. "Right," Thornton said to Collins, "get them processed. Medical inspection first, delousing, then hot food. I want every man examined for wounds, infections, malnutrition indicators. Anyone requiring urgent treatment goes directly to medical facility. Everyone gets clean clothes from stores, proper boots if we've got their sizes. Blankets distributed tonight before lights out." Collins hesitated. "Sir, some of the lads, Davies especially, they're not comfortable with—" "I'm aware of Sergeant Davies's opinions. He's made them abundantly clear in every staff meeting for 3 months." Thornton's voice carried that particular edge officers developed when they'd explained something too many times. "These orders come from my authority as camp commander, reinforced by Geneva Convention requirements and supported by strategic intelligence priorities from War Office. Davies will implement them precisely, or Davies will explain his refusal to a court-martial board. Am I understood?" "Yes, sir." The processing began. One by one, prisoners moved through reception. Names recorded, ranks noted, personal effects catalogued. A corporal, barely 18, started crying when given a cup of tea, actual sugar dissolved in it, steam rising in the cold air. Another, older, perhaps 25, stared at the blanket thrust into his arms as though it might explode. A private, with infected shrapnel wounds in his shoulder, was carried to medical facility by 2 British orderlies, who handled him with the same care they'd give their own wounded. Thornton watched from his office window, the one overlooking the main compound. The arithmetic continued. 63 new prisoners meant increased food requisitions, additional medical supplies, adjusted work detail rotations. But also 63 potential sources of tactical intelligence, 63 individuals who might, with proper handling, provide information that could save British lives when interrogated properly. His telephone rang. London. A colonel from War Office Intelligence Section, following up on Thornton's monthly report. "Your mortality rate is lowest in the Northern Command, Thornton. Escape attempts practically non-existent. Whatever you're doing, keep it up. We need these prisoners cooperative, not martyred. The intelligence they're providing from your facility has been unusually detailed." After the call ended, Thornton returned to the window. Evening now, the Yorkshire sky turning that particular shade of grey that preceded sunset in March. In the compound below, British soldiers and German prisoners moved through their routines, work details returning from farms where they'd been repairing walls damaged by winter, medical personnel conducting evening rounds, kitchen staff distributing dinner rations. The German boy, who'd cried over his tea, was now sitting outside his Nissen hut, blanket wrapped around thin shoulders, talking quietly with 2 others. The arithmetic of mercy, Thornton thought, was more complex than simple cruelty. Cruelty was easy, straightforward, emotionally satisfying. Mercy required constant justification, eternal vigilance against those who'd call it betrayal. But the numbers didn't lie. Fewer deaths, fewer incidents, better intelligence. His son Michael would never come home, would never sit in Yorkshire cold, wrapped in blankets, discussing the future. But these German boys might. And perhaps, in some equation, Thornton didn't fully understand but could glimpse the outline of that mattered too. 23rd March 1945, 06:15 hours, 9 days since the new arrivals. Camp 174 operated under constraints that would have seemed impossible to anyone who hadn't lived through 5 years of total war. Every decision, every comfort, every small mercy had to be justified against the brutal arithmetic of a nation stretched to breaking point. Britain, in spring 1945, existed in a state of exhausted perseverance. Cities still burning from V2 strikes, rationing tighter than ever, electricity cuts scheduled with military precision, coal shortages meaning homes stayed cold, even as spring struggled to arrive. The camp kitchen exemplified this reality perfectly. Sergeant Martha Henshaw, 47, formerly a cook at a Leeds hotel now requisitioned for military housing, managed food preparation for 1,010 prisoners and 156 staff, with supplies that arrived weekly from army distribution centres. This morning, like every morning, she stood in the pre-dawn darkness calculating possibilities with stub of pencil and paper that had been used so many times the numbers overlapped into illegible palimpsest. "Right," she muttered to her assistant, Corporal Ann Preston, 23, whose husband was somewhere in Germany with the advancing armies. "We've got 42 pounds of mutton. Quality questionable. 100 weight of potatoes, half of them sprouting. Dried beans, 20 pounds. Tinned vegetables from American shipment, thank God for that. Powdered milk, barely enough. Sugar's critically short again." Preston checked their stores, breath visible in the unheated kitchen. "The German prisoners are entitled to same rations as British soldiers per Geneva Convention, ma'am. But with what we've got..." "I'm aware of the regulations, Corporal. I'm also aware that every potato we feed them is a potato not feeding civilians in Manchester who spent last night in shelters while V2s fell. The politics of this situation are not my concern. Making sure everyone eats something approximating hot food is." Henshaw's voice carried Yorkshire pragmatism, sharpened by years of making impossible calculations. "We'll do stew. Bulk it out with barley from last month's consignment. Not appetizing, but it'll keep bodies warm and functioning." This was the reality Thornton navigated daily, providing humanitarian treatment while bombs still fell on British cities, maintaining moral standards while families received telegrams about sons who'd never return, showing mercy to prisoners whose compatriots had devastated British infrastructure with methodical precision. The political pressure was constant. Local civilians questioned why Germans received blankets when British hospitals operated with linen shortages. Home Guard members asked why prisoners ate hot food when their own grandchildren queued for hours for bread. The work details represented Thornton's compromise between humanitarian obligation and national necessity. German POWs were deployed throughout Yorkshire, repairing bomb-damaged infrastructure in Hull, working agricultural labour on farms depleted of young men, clearing rubble from industrial sites in Sheffield. These weren't comfortable assignments, 10-hour days in March weather, heavy labour, constant supervision, but they were conducted within Geneva Convention guidelines and provided genuinely needed labour in economy running on fumes and determination. Prisoner Klaus Steiner, 19, from Bremen, worked a farm detail 15 miles from camp. He'd arrived in that initial March transport, the one where he'd cried over tea. Now 9 days later, he stood in morning formation, waiting for lorry transport, blankets still wrapped around shoulders because British authorities had permitted prisoners to use them during outdoor work in cold weather. This single mercy, permission to stay warm, represented hours of Thornton arguing with bureaucrats in London who considered blankets excessive comfort provision. And the farm where Steiner worked belonged to Albert Morrison, 68, whose 2 sons fought in Burma and whose grandson had died at Arnhem. Morrison had initially refused to accept German labor, standing in his farmyard shouting about betrayal and collaboration, until Thornton visited personally. The conversation had been difficult, emotional, brutal in its honesty. "My grandson was 21, Morrison had said, voice breaking. "Paratrooper. The telegram came Christmas Eve. You're asking me to work alongside the bastards who killed him?" Thornton had responded with statistics, not emotion. "Your farm produces food for 140 civilian families in Hull. Without labor, you can't harvest. Without harvest, those families starve. The German prisoners will work, or they'll sit in camp consuming resources without contributing. Your choice, but understand the consequences either way." Morrison had relented, but maintained cold distance from the prisoners. Until the second week, when Steiner noticed water pump failure threatening livestock. The boy had engineering training, had worked his father's machine shop in Bremen before conscription. He fixed the pump using improvised tools and Morrison's limited equipment, working through lunch break without being asked. That evening, Morrison brought tea to the workers, didn't speak, didn't smile, but the tea was hot and came in proper cups. These small transformations accumulated across Yorkshire. A prisoner helped deliver a calf in difficult birth, saving both animals. Another taught a farmer's wife basic German so she could read her POW son's censored letters from somewhere in Soviet territory. A third played violin, borrowed from local church, at memorial service for British soldier killed in final German offensive. None of this erased the war, didn't resurrect the dead, didn't undo 6 years of industrial-scale violence. But it complicated the narrative, disrupted the clean arithmetic of pure hatred. In Camp 174's medical facility, Dr. Eleanor Braithwaite confronted different mathematics. She was 36, trained at Edinburgh, served with RAMC in North Africa before assignment to POW medical services. Her current patient list included 17 Germans with tuberculosis, 23 with malnutrition-related complications, 47 with inadequately treated combat wounds, and 1 with suspected appendicitis requiring immediate surgery. "The ethical calculation is straightforward," she'd explained to Thornton during their weekly medical review. "These are human beings under our care. We treat them to same standard as our own soldiers, or we violate both Geneva Convention and basic medical ethics." End of discussion. But discussion never ended. Every sulfur drug used for German infection was sulfur drug unavailable for British civilian. Every surgical procedure consumed supplies manufactured in factories operating under constant air raid threat. Every hour Dr. Braithwaite spent treating prisoners was hour not spent at Hull Hospital, where bombing casualties still arrived weekly. The arithmetic was brutal, perpetual, inescapable. Yet data-supported humanitarian approach, prisoner cooperation during interrogation had increased dramatically since Thornton implemented improved conditions. German POWs provided detailed information about troop deployments, fortification layouts, morale conditions, supply chain vulnerabilities. This intelligence saved British lives in combat zones. The equation balanced, even if the emotional weight never equalized. Evening formation, 1800 hours, temperature dropping toward frost, prisoners lined up for dinner distribution, Henshaw's stew bulked with barley, not delicious but hot and filling. Each man received same portion, served by British soldiers who'd learned to see individuals rather than abstractions. Private Collins, who'd initially questioned Thornton's policies, now knew prisoners by name, asked about their families, shared cigarettes during rest breaks. In his office, Thornton reviewed that day's reports. 0 incidents. 2 prisoners received medical treatment for minor injuries. 14 sent letters home through Red Cross. Work details completed without incident. 1 prisoner requested book from camp library. The library was Thornton's personal project. Books donated by local churches, newspapers saved and distributed, educational classes conducted by university students exempt from military service. Every intellectual engagement was a calculated act of subversion against Nazi ideology. Demonstrate that British values included education, culture, thoughtfulness, even toward enemies. The telephone rang again. Different colonel, different question. Thornton, we're hearing concerns from civilians. Questions about why prisoners receive better treatment than some war widows. How do you respond? Thornton had prepared this answer months ago. We maintain humanitarian standards because that's what distinguishes us from the enemy. We demonstrate British values through actions, not rhetoric. And strategically, prisoners who experience human dignity provide better intelligence than prisoners motivated by revenge. The program works, sir. The data proves it. After the call, he walked the perimeter. Night settling over Yorkshire, stars visible for once without smoke obscuring them. In the compound, prisoners gathered in small groups, talking quietly in German mixed with broken English. Laughter drifted across cold air, actual laughter, not bitter or cruel, but genuine. Steiner sat with 3 others, sharing story about the water pump, gesturing animatedly. British guards watched with relaxed alertness, vigilant but not hostile. This was the architecture of humanity Thornton had built from inadequate supplies and contested principles. Not comfortable, not erasure of war's realities, but genuine attempt to maintain civilization's standards even in civilization's collapse. The arithmetic remained brutal. Every kindness to Germans was kindness some British civilian didn't receive. But Thornton had decided that preserving humanity's possibility mattered more than revenge's satisfaction. History would judge whether he'd calculated correctly. 15th April 1945, 800 hours, precisely. 6 weeks since the first transport arrived. Camp 174 had settled into rhythm that defied expectations on both sides of the wire. For German prisoners, particularly those who'd spent their entire adolescence consuming Goebbels' carefully crafted narrative about Allied barbarism, the cognitive dissonance approached philosophical crisis. They'd been taught through radio broadcasts, mandatory Hitler Youth sessions, newsreels showing alleged Allied atrocities, that capture meant torture, starvation, execution. Instead, they received porridge with actual sugar, medical attention that saved infected limbs, and guards who occasionally shared jokes about weather being miserable for everyone, regardless of nationality. Unteroffizier Hans Weber, 22, captured near Wesel during Rhine crossing, sat in education barracks attempting to reconcile his entire worldview with observable reality. He joined Wehrmacht in 1941, true believer in Germany's mission, convinced of British degeneracy and American savagery. 4 years of combat had complicated that certainty, but core propaganda remained embedded. The enemy was subhuman, cruel, incapable of mercy. Then came capture. The American unit that took him prisoner had shared chocolate, not interrogation technique, just soldiers being decent to exhausted boy who'd stopped shooting. Transfer to British custody brought anticipation of proper brutality. Surely the Americans were anomaly. Surely the British, who'd endured 6 years of bombing, would deliver promised vengeance. Instead, hot tea, medical inspection, blanket that didn't have lice, bed that wasn't mud. They're trying to break us psychologically, he'd insisted to fellow prisoners that first week. Make us weak, then the real treatment begins. Standard interrogation technique. But weeks passed. Treatment didn't deteriorate. If anything, conditions improved as Thornton secured additional supplies. Weber couldn't reconcile this with propaganda's certainty about Allied cruelty. The dissonance created mental vertigo. If the British weren't monsters, what did that mean about the cause he'd fought for? If they could show humanity to prisoners whose nation had devastated their cities, what did that reveal about competing moral frameworks? The education program intensified this crisis. Classes were voluntary, conducted by British instructors, supplemented by German-speaking academics from Leeds and York universities. Topics ranged from English language basics to British history, literature, political philosophy. Nothing overtly anti-German, but everything implicitly challenging Nazi ideology through exposure to alternative perspectives. Students read Shakespeare, discussed Magna Carta's significance, learned about parliamentary democracy's evolution. Professor Margaret Whitmore, 53, historian from York University, taught twice weekly. Her son commanded tank squadron in Germany. Her nephew died at Tobruk. Her house in York had lost windows during bombing raid in 42. Yet she stood before German prisoners, treating them as students deserving intellectual engagement. Her approach was Socratic: ask questions, let them discover contradictions in their own propaganda, rather than lecturing. "Let's examine your propaganda's claims about British brutality," she said during one session, her tone academic rather than accusatory. "You were taught we'd execute prisoners, yes. Yet here you sit, alive, fed, educated. Why the discrepancy between prediction and reality?" Weber, attending reluctantly, found himself responding, "Propaganda serves wartime morale. Both sides exaggerate enemy cruelty." "Precisely. So if your government lied about this, what else might they have lied about?" Whitmore's question hung in air like smoke from outside cigarettes. She didn't push further. Let the question work its corrosive magic on certainties built from propaganda's foundation. Similar transformations occurred throughout camp's operations. German prisoners working farm details encountered British civilians, whose response to their presence ranged from cold tolerance to unexpected kindness. Morrison, the farmer who'd lost his grandson, gradually shifted from hostile silence to grudging acknowledgement that Steiner's mechanical competence genuinely helped maintain farm operations. Not friendship. Morrison's grief remained too raw, but recognition of shared humanity beneath uniforms and national identities. In German High Command's remaining operational headquarters, intelligence officers analyzed puzzling pattern. Prisoners repatriated through Red Cross exchanges or medical evacuations returned with unexpectedly positive reports about British captivity. Some dismissed this as Allied psychological operation, attempts to undermine morale. But accumulating data suggested something more fundamental. British had calculated that humane treatment produced strategic advantages, outweighing revenge's emotional satisfaction. Oberst Friedrich Hartmann, career intelligence officer, reviewed interrogation transcripts from prisoners who'd experienced Camp 174 before repatriation. The reports were unsettling. Prisoners describing warm food, medical care exceeding Geneva Convention minimums, educational opportunities, guards who treated them as individuals rather than enemy abstractions. Hartmann's professional assessment: Britain had weaponized humanity, turning mercy into intelligence-gathering tool more effective than physical coercion. "They've discovered what we never grasped," he told his deputy in late April conversation. "Treating prisoners decently doesn't weaken military effectiveness. It strengthens intelligence capabilities, reduces guard requirements, eliminates resistance. We beat prisoners expecting that would break them. British feed prisoners, and that accomplishes what our brutality never achieved." This represented profound doctrinal failure. Nazi military philosophy presumed that cruelty demonstrated strength, that mercy signified weakness. British approach inverted that equation. Strength meant maintaining humanitarian standards despite enemies' previous actions. Weakness meant surrendering civilization's values to revenge's simplicity. The contradiction challenged German strategic doctrine at fundamental level. Back in Camp 174, the transformation continued at individual level. Weber started attending Professor Whitmore's classes voluntarily, engaging seriously with material that complicated his previous certainties. He read Dickens, translated German edition from camp library, and encountered portrayal of British society vastly different from propaganda's caricature. He worked farm detail, where Morrison eventually spoke to him. Brief conversation about mechanical repair techniques. Nothing profound, but acknowledgement of shared technical language transcending national conflict. The crisis came during mail call, 28th April. Weber received letter through Red Cross from his mother in Bremen. Allied bombing had destroyed their neighborhood, his younger sister killed in the rubble, his father missing. The news arrived in camp, where his captors provided regular meals, medical care, intellectual stimulation. The juxtaposition created unbearable tension. How could he accept humanity from the people whose bombs had killed his sister? He sat in barracks, letter trembling in his hands, surrounded by prisoners facing similar cognitive dissonance. British soldiers noticed his distress. Private Collins approached cautiously, saw the letter's content, understood without speaking German what news had arrived. He didn't offer platitudes, didn't pretend the situation was anything but awful. Just brought tea, sat nearby in silent solidarity that acknowledged tragedy without erasing it. That night Thornton walked the compound as usual. He paused where Weber sat alone, staring at stars above Yorkshire moors. The Major didn't speak immediately, just stood in shared cold. Two men from opposing armies, inhabiting brief moment outside war's categories. Finally Thornton spoke quietly. Heard about your sister. I'm sorry. Lost my son over Hamburg, 43. Bombing raid. I understand that particular pain. Weber looked up, shocked that camp commander knew his circumstances, more shocked at revelation of shared loss. Then how? He started, couldn't finish. How can I treat you decently when your countrymen killed my son? Thornton completed the question. Because the alternative is perpetual revenge, endless cycle of justified cruelty. Because someone has to break that pattern or we'll fight forever. Because treating you humanely doesn't resurrect my Michael, but it might prevent your younger brother from dying in next war. The logic was cold, strategic, but underneath ran genuine conviction that humanity's preservation required resisting revenge's obvious arithmetic. Weber didn't respond, couldn't respond, but something shifted in his expression. Recognition, perhaps, that mercy's complexity exceeded propaganda's simple categories of strength and weakness. In Berlin's ruins, Nazi leadership maintained propaganda about Allied cruelty, even as their own prisoners reported contrary evidence. But in Camp 174 and hundreds of similar facilities across Britain, different narrative emerged. Not innocent, not whitewashing war's devastation, but demonstrating that maintaining civilization's standards during civilization's collapse was possible. The arithmetic of mercy had calculated that preserving enemies' humanity might preserve your own. History would judge whether the equation balanced. 8th May 1945, 1100 hours precisely. VE Day. Throughout Britain, celebration erupted with desperate relief. Street parties in bombed-out neighborhoods, Churchill's voice on wireless, people dancing in Trafalgar Square despite years of exhaustion, grief, rationing, and accumulated trauma finally released in collective exhale. In Camp 174, the atmosphere was necessarily more complicated. Jubilation for guards witnessing war's end, subdued uncertainty for prisoners facing futures without clear shape, shared awareness that victory and defeat were simple words for vastly complex realities. Major Thornton stood in his office, watching the compound through familiar window. 6 months commanding this facility, 6 months navigating impossible arithmetic of maintaining humanity while war continued its grinding devastation. Now the war in Europe had ended, and different calculations emerged. What happened to 19910 German prisoners when their nation had ceased to exist? When cities they'd called home were rubble administered by occupying armies? When families might be dead, missing, or trapped in Soviet zones where communication remained impossible? The immediate administrative challenges were substantial. War Office had issued preliminary guidance. POWs would remain in British custody pending repatriation planning, but timeline remained undefined. German infrastructure had collapsed so completely that returning prisoners to functional communities wasn't currently possible. Meanwhile, Britain needed labour for reconstruction, bomb damage repair, agricultural work, industrial recovery, and prisoners represented trained workforce already integrated into local economies. Dr. Braithwaite submitted her final wartime medical report that afternoon. Mortality rate in Camp 174 during Thornton's command, 0.3%, lowest in Northern Command, well below military average for British soldiers in similar period. Infectious disease rates, 70% below comparable facilities. Violent incidents, 12 in 6 months, all minor, none resulting in serious injury. Escape attempts. 2, both prisoners recaptured within hours, motivated by family concerns rather than military purpose. The data validated Thornton's humanitarian approach with merciless statistical clarity. But statistics didn't capture transformation's human dimension. Klaus Steiner, the boy who'd cried over tea in March, now worked Morrison's farm with competence that bordered on indispensable. His mechanical skills had saved harvest equipment, repaired vehicles, maintained infrastructure that would have collapsed without intervention. Morrison, whose grief remained raw, permanent wound, had gradually developed grudging respect that approached something uncomfortably like affection for the German boy who'd killed himself working to prove worth. "What happens to him now?" Morrison asked Thornton during visit to coordinate continued labor assignments. "War's over. Does he go back to Bremen, assuming Bremen still exists?" Thornton showed him reconnaissance photos of Bremen's devastation. 90% of city centre destroyed by repeated bombing, infrastructure collapsed, population dispersed, or dead. "There's nothing to return to, Mr. Morrison. His mother's letter last month mentioned living in rural camp for displaced civilians. Father still missing. Going home means going to ruin." Morrison absorbed this in Yorkshire silence that meant emotional processing happening beneath expressionless surface. Finally, suppose he could stay on here then, until something's sorted. Not permanently, mind you, just until his country exists again as functional entity, Thornton suggested gently. That might be years, potentially decades. Aye, well, farm needs labour, doesn't it? This conversation repeated across Yorkshire, across Britain, across Western Allied occupation zones. Prisoners who'd been enemies became individuals with names, skills, personalities, tragic family situations. Local communities that had initially resisted their presence now advocated for their continued employment. Economic necessity merged with uncomfortable human recognition. These were boys who'd been conscripted into ideology most hadn't initially questioned, surviving incomprehensible devastation, now facing futures without foundation. Hans Weber, the propaganda believer whose certainty had crumbled under sustained exposure to reality, contradicting official narrative, remained in Camp 174, but transformed its nature. With war's end, education program expanded. Professor Whitmore recruited additional instructors, established proper curriculum covering subjects from English literature to democratic governance theory. Weber enrolled in advanced courses, his intellectual curiosity finally liberated from propaganda's constraining framework. One afternoon in late May, he approached Thornton's office. First-time prisoner had initiated direct contact with Commander. His English had improved dramatically through intensive study combined with daily interaction with guards and civilian workers. "Major Thornton, sir, may I speak frankly?" His formal correctness carried lingering military training overlaid with genuine respect that had nothing to do with rank structures. "Of course, Weber. I've been thinking about Professor Whitmore's questions, about what we were told versus what we experienced, about the discrepancy between propaganda and reality." Weber's struggle with articulation was visible but determined. "Everything I believed about British people, about democracy, about the war itself, it was constructed from lies. You didn't torture us. You fed us, educated us, treated us as human beings despite what we'd done to your cities. Why? Thornton considered his response carefully. Because the alternative was becoming what we fought against. Because preserving civilization's standards during civilization's collapse was the only victory that mattered long-term. Because treating you brutally might have satisfied immediate emotion, but would have validated everything your propaganda claimed about us. Weber absorbed this, nodded slowly. You weaponized mercy. That's one interpretation. I prefer to think we maintained principles despite extreme provocation. Thornton paused, then added with Yorkshire directness, also, practically speaking, humanitarian treatment produced better intelligence, fewer security incidents, and useful labor. The ethical approach and the strategic approach aligned. That doesn't often happen in war. The conversation represented in microcosm the transformation Thornton had engineered across 6 months, not erasing conflict's reality, not pretending devastation hadn't occurred, but demonstrating that enemies could become individuals, that mercy could coexist with security, that humanitarian standards serve strategic purposes beyond moral satisfaction. By June 1945, Camp 174's nature had shifted fundamentally. Still technically POW facility, but increasingly resembling labor camp with educational components, transition facility for men without homes to return to, demonstration project for occupation policies being implemented across Germany. International observers visited regularly, including American officers developing their own POW management protocols, Red Cross inspectors verifying Geneva Convention compliance, even Soviet representatives studying Western approach to captivity management with visible skepticism about humanitarian methods. The long-term consequences would unfold over decades. Many prisoners remained in Britain for years, some permanently, integrated into communities they'd once been trained to destroy. Steiner eventually married local girl. Morrison's niece, as it happened, became British citizen, worked the farm he'd once been assigned as enemy prisoner. Weber returned to Germany in 1948, used education received at Camp 174 to attend university, became academic specializing in democratic theory and post-war reconstruction. Thornton himself never achieved public recognition for his humanitarian leadership. In nation exhausted by 6 years of total war, treating German prisoners decently wasn't politically popular story. But in restricted military circles, his statistical success became model for POW management, demonstrating that humanitarian treatment wasn't moral luxury, but strategic advantage, that mercy could be calculated approach to enemy management rather than weakness to be exploited. The final irony was historical. Britain's humanitarian POW treatment, replicated across thousands of camps, affecting hundreds of thousands of German prisoners, represented significant strategic victory that history almost forgot to record. It didn't involve dramatic battles, heroic charges, or technological breakthrough. Just daily decision to maintain civilization's standards when revenge would have been easier, emotionally satisfying, and seemingly justified. Major William Thornton retired in 1947, returned to Manchester, never spoke publicly about his wartime service. But on his desk in modest terraced house, he kept photographs from Camp 174's Liberation Day, German prisoners and British guards standing together, not friends exactly, but humans, who'd navigated impossible situation without surrendering to hatred's simplicity. The arithmetic of mercy, he'd learned, balanced differently than anticipated. Not through moral superiority or naive pacifism, but through hard calculation that preserving enemies' humanity might be the only way to preserve your own. When future wars came, and they would, inevitably, the data from Camp 174 and similar facilities would inform new approaches to captivity, interrogation, humanitarian standards during conflict. Small legacy perhaps, but genuine one, demonstrating that even in war's darkest chapters, maintaining human dignity remained possible, practical, and strategically valuable. The German boys who braced for cruelty and received warm blankets would carry that lesson forward, and perhaps that would matter more than any battle won through violence alone. If this untold story of compassion behind barbed wire moved you, if you're keen to discover more forgotten chapters of the Second World War that reveal humanity in our darkest hours, do subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below, sharing your thoughts, or if your own family history connects to these remarkable events. Your engagement keeps these vital stories alive for future generations. Thank you for watching.